Hey there, we're Simply Worldbuilding.
Thanks for tuning in. This is episode 3. In the latter end of our episode, we touched on a few of the monsters that we were talking about, but also one thing that we mentioned is how things sort of interact. One thing I'm sure everyone is waiting to see and talk about is how to make a map and geography. And so we figured probably the easiest way to start jumping into how things interact with each other is to start putting them beside each other and creating the geography in which they live in. We're probably not going to jump into drawing out the map immediately. We might have some like light sketching or stuff like that, but it's going to be mostly creating little pieces that you're going to start shoving together, and then once you have a bit more of a concrete idea, you can start to actually draw out the map and have those things. But it's mostly just going to be flailing around and trying to figure out proximity from things to other things and sort of how the geography is going to work.
Map building is like, for a lot of people, some of the most fun that you can have in world building, and I'm at least partially on that train. I do love making a map and making the world kind of physically present. But in the spirit of having things interact with things, we're going to expand a little bit on having our themes interact with the map, especially because of how our theme is going to operate. And so, at least partially, it's going to go hand in hand with geography. So we'll jump into that a little bit today. And we'll worry about things like rivers and like specific features or who's where later on. We'll just kind of put out some feelers so that we can get things, get the roots down.
Yeah, you really got to start from a bit of a flaily sort of area. You just start taking stuff and throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, and
like
then
we
start to build
mentioned right
from
at
there.
the beginning, start big, and then focus smaller later and later and later. So we might possibly put down the actual shape of some things, but we won't fill out borders and probably rivers unless it's a very significant river or whatever. Today.
A question on making a map. Do you have any sort of recommendation on softwares to use or
Techniques and stuff?
Any techniques or styles in terms of map making?
There's a handful of really good techniques and stuff. I don't think that necessarily I chose or can specifically recommend software, but definitely I know of a handful of techniques. Probably a lot of people have heard of like the beans method or the rice method or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well.
That's a classic. It's quite good because for anybody who doesn't know the rice or the beans method or whatever,
would be me.
is you take a whole bunch of rice, like a handful of rice or a handful of beans, and you drop them on a paper, and basically that's the shape of your continent. You now trace around that with a Sharpie or a whatever, and it'll give you little like rough coastlines, it'll give you big land masses, it'll give you small islands, and it's a surprisingly effective method of creating a map. And then of course you can change things you don't like later, but it gives you a really good start.
It's a way to sort of insert a level of realistic randomness into when you're trying to make a continent. It's something to consider is like, there is actually a reason you'd want to do either rice or beans, is a level of detail.
100%.
Because with beans, they're going, your sort of curves are going to be a little bit larger and more rounded, and so it can either make it seem like it's a smaller place, and so the smaller details are kind of zoomed in on, and then if you do it with rice, like your details are exactly, the details will be very fine, and so you can end up creating something that looks way bigger. And then like you said, you can also just kind of adjust those things as you go, but like I said, it gives you a level of randomness that you can kind of just start to toy with from there, so it doesn't feel artificial when you start to actually draw things out.
And with any method, whatever you end up choosing, if you have anything in your head that you want to make sure is in there, you can absolutely put them in first and build around it, or you can kind of have a general idea and then put them in. And the earlier you do that, the better, because then you can work on making it feel like it belongs there, rather than you toss it in as an afterthought or shoehorned it in or anything like that. So that's one thing I do want to talk about in this episode is there anything that we want specifically? Because I know that there's at least a handful of things that we do.
Well, there's at least 3 set pieces that we're going to need because of inherently the creatures that we've made. We're going to need the mountain range related to the red dragon. We're going to need the mountain related to the wind dragon, and we're going to need, at the very least, a coastline for the turtle to interact with. And that was also another thing, is the turtle is probably going to be almost the most demanding because it travels throughout the ocean. And I think we established that there was going to be 4 different sort of areas that it ends up going to throughout its sort of cycles.
More like temperature zones than anything, I think. Because that is one thing that is going to be a fairly big impact on your world physically, and it doesn't necessarily have to work exactly like it does on Earth, but things like the equator and the poles and stuff like that. Because if on our world as we know it, if you are further away from the equator, it's much colder. And if you're closer to the equator, it's much warmer. For the most part. There's other weather things, but in general, for sure, that's kind of how that works. So it can work differently in your world, or it can be the exact same. In my personal world, the main continent that the players are playing on is the most southern tip of the continent is pretty close to like the tropics line, and so it's pretty warm down there, and then also not a terribly big globe, so it gets much colder as you get to the tips, and there is further north and there is further south, but it kind of gives you an idea on how your world is going to be shaped, is going to feel, because the more north you go, the more cold it's going to be.
And it's going to get colder rapidly because of the size too, which is something to consider. One thing I do kind of want to mention was something that helped me out quite a bit when it came down to trying to figure out realism on actually trying to create climates. It was something I kind of got really, really stuck on, was trying to make geography that felt realistic. And one thing I learned from becoming very obsessed with that is the fact that you really don't need to. Not often is anyone going to complain about geography changes. Like, you could go from a tropical place into a desert, and realistically, no one's probably going to mention it. Like, it's not actually going to be that fine of a detail. And so when it comes down to making hyper realistic climates and geography and biomes and stuff like that, don't get too hung up on it. It's kind of a fun thing to think about. And one thing that, when I was kind of diving down this rabbit hole, that helped me was there's a handful of videos on YouTube. If you look up like geography for fantasy, like tons of videos will come up. But one channel that helped me out quite a bit, I believe, was this one called Artifexian or something like that. If it's the right one, they have a lot of stuff about how climates actually become the way they are, like things to do with tectonic plates and how that creates mountain ranges, things to do with how oceanic currents, warm and cold, can affect how seasons are, or the climate on land, and the precipitation levels and what that actually does. Things to consider, like the easiest example is probably
wind erosion. If there aren't enough trees, then the wind is going to scrape up the land, and it's going to erode fast. There's so much.
There's so many little details. One that I ended up kind of considering for the world that I built was, I forget what it's called, but it's when there's a mountain range that stops precipitation from coming from the ocean. It sort of stops it, and so on one side of the mountains you'll find that's closest to the ocean, it'll often be a very wet climate because all of the clouds end up getting caught by the mountains and just end up staying in the singular area. And so as such, on the other side of the mountains, you're going to have a very, very dry climate. Like I said, this happened in when I was creating what I have of my map of my world. The ocean's on one side, and then it ends up finding a mountain range, and on the other side is a barren desert. And so there are little things to consider like that when you're making a map, but don't get too caught in it. It's probably not going to be relevant unless you want it to be.
It's still fantasy. You know, there can easily be a disconnect, and if you find that it is too jarring, there's a million ways to make it feel more natural. You can put a physical barrier in between two things. You can have some kind of large-scale world-affecting event that has taken place. There's a lot of things that can, if it feels too silly and jarring, there's a lot of ways to make it make sense, but don't get too stuck on it, because you can beat your head against that wall for a million years. World's complicated, man, so...
Exactly, and so... getting caught, I still find myself a little bit caught in, well, how do I make this make sense? And it's like, just put the forest there, man. No one's gonna bug you about it. Yeah. So either way, yeah, don't sweat the small stuff when it comes down to making your map. But if you think that's fun as well, like don't hesitate at the same time.
By all means, yeah.
And it is fun to kind of understand and look up little things about nature that you kind of don't think about. Like, one thing you'll see often is if you see a river on a map, a lot of the time they'll sort of look like this. They'll have these sort of cross sections that that just exist, and a lot of people sort of think that rivers will split going this way, but in actuality, typically on the map, if you see sort of forks in the river, it's actually the other way around. The rivers are typically flowing into a singular river that ends up going into the ocean. And that was just something, in obsessing over the geography of things and doing a whole bunch of research, you end up finding out. And it's sort of just interesting and can help you in the future of world building, just understanding a little bit of how geography works. But again, if you have a river that splits, that's cool, bro.
Yeah, exactly. So be it.
But yeah, so just have fun with it and don't get too caught up in it. But it's also fun to check it out and see the tiny little details. Now, in regards to the geography in our world, I think what we were kind of talking about is the fact that it's probably going to be a very important piece of our world, because
even some of these, like as our theme is, some of these Leviathan creatures are going to flirt the boundaries between creature and geography.
Yeah, they're such an enormous set piece that, yeah, like especially like the turtle, it is its own geography almost technically.
Yeah.
And I think an important question, because we were saying these things aren't born, they're made. I think one thing that we really have to dive into, and is probably better sooner than later, is how this actually happens and how the magic system interacts with the world around it.
So one thing, we can take it or leave it, but I have canon in my world is how magic works can very much influence geography in the way that, to keep it simple, ley lines and ley line nodes and everything like that. So the magic sort of emanates from ley lines. And so if you see that an area is particularly dense in magical ley lines, that typically there are more extraordinary events, extraordinary creatures and magical things going on around it. So without going too far in depth for the time being into how my thing works, it kind of struck me as possibly, if we were to do something similar to that, that maybe not necessarily magic itself, but there's some kind of, well, let's say that they are potentially created of the earth at an intersection, a node where multiple ley lines converge, for instance. Because then there's an excess of magical energy, it's buried in the earth or something like that, and something like that interacts with the actual earth itself. almost not to be dark, but like a cancer cell, right?
Mhm.
Like radioactive waves like interacting with cells,
Mhm.
and then it promotes all this exponential growth, for instance. It can
Mhm.
kind of almost like similar to how that works.
Interesting.
Is kind of the first thing that came to my mind, if they're created of the earth rather
Mhm.
than born.
I would say how my stuff works is kind of similar, although I wouldn't put it onto a specific line or anything like that. Although you can say that's a little bit more of just a metaphor for like magical flow
Mhm.
than actual like just laying a grid over top of things. But the way magic sort of works in my world is the way things. It's sort of hard to describe, but to use a very overly simplistic metaphor, like you're walking through the forest or beside a river, and you find a stick, and it's just a regular stick, but then you find one that's got like kind of a cool knot in it, and it's really unique and kind of strange in a way, and you're like, that's a cool stick, and you want to keep that stick. That's a more magical stick than a regular one. And if you sort of expand that out into the world itself, things that end up becoming unique New York. No. If you have a regular sized forest, it's somewhat magical. If you have a gigantic, incredibly dense forest with a really cool waterfall, it's a more magical place. And so it's sort of
the old growth.
and so that's sort of how it works, is the more extravagant and the more unique things are, is the more magical the place is. I feel like that kind of can work with almost the same way that you're thinking. It's just instead of like some sort of cross section, it's just how it's just things flourishing and becoming more unique as it grows.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean?
I think I understand what you're talking about.
I'm not explaining it perfectly well, but for example, a creature that sort of sprouts of the forest, when initially spread out, probably from just a sort of unique landmark or something like that. Like you see, just if you're going through a forest and then there's this unique landmark, like just say like a large stone wall that just kind of looks like a canvas or something like that. Things can sprout from nature itself, it sort of snowballs into.
It's the compounding interest of magic.
Yeah, exactly. And so one thing changing in a sort of strange or unique way that just generally probably wouldn't happen. It's sort of miraculous things breed more miraculous things. And it sort of grows, like you said, in a similar way to, like you were saying, if magic sort of converges into a singular area, it creates this sort of growth. But in the way I would think of it, it's like that growth almost just kind of bakes itself. And in my world, the geography is actually very much based on that. Like the stuff, again, going back to the stuff with the giants. Giants are actually probably the greatest example of this. Is in my world, hill giants, stone giants, storm giants, all are not necessarily born, but are spawned of magical influence of the geography around it. I think a mixture of both of those things could be cool. So you have magical energy that sort of maybe converges into a space for one reason or another, but in creating something magical like a tree or just any sort of anything, it almost sort of acts as a magnet.
Yeah, well, if magic is almost kind of like water always finds the path of least resistance, right? And so, like, speaking of rivers from before, like they will all come together as one because that's the path of least resistance. They'll follow gravity, they'll follow natural valleys, and then they'll slowly carve their own path over time and converge in one place in the ocean. So maybe it's that magic, regardless of how it got there, maybe it was, a random creation kind of thing, and then it slowly sort of siphons in more magic, and then as there's more magical density, it brings in more and more magic.
So it's sort of a magical gravity.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of a cool way to look at it, and I think that would be exactly what sort of spawns these creatures, is enough sort of magical energy begins to congregate into a singular area, and then when miraculously enough kind of is there, because the magical energy is also going to be specifically, like, basically imprinted with what's around it. You know what I mean? If it's in a volcano, you're going to get that related type of magic. If it's in a forest, you're going to get that related type of magic. And so it sort of congregates into and becomes a living thing that sort of represents the area that's around it.
And so do you think that this sort of magical gravity well is expended in the creation of these creatures to, in my mind, kind of prevent just the fact that there's like this place on the globe that is now insanely magical. It's pulling magic from everywhere else. Like it just like to compound forever and just keep.
That is actually kind of an interesting point too. It could almost be a way for nature to start to disperse its own magical energy, because if it becomes too concentrated, it basically gives it an active will and says, go do something and change the area. Which is kind of an interesting way to think of just like the forces of nature in its own way. It's like magic is congregating into this, magical energy is congregating into this area. There's almost too much at this point, and it's almost kind of becoming stagnant and greedy. We need to give it some sort of active force so that it can change the area around it. And that's sort of why I was picturing, at least with our initial three, them being so huge, is the fact that they've absorbed so much of this magical energy that and nothing's contested them for so long that they themselves are gigantic acting forces within the world, and change the flow of magic just because they're essentially, they have their own gravity and sort of move things around with them. So I think that's an interesting way to think of how the magic works and how it sprouts from the geography. I think that's definitely a good idea. So at least we have like a system to start creating these things on.
So do you think that there's some sort of do we know what the magical spark plug is that's like creates the initial thing that then begins to like over time swell up? Like what that
like the first
ignition is?
The first piece that begins attracting others.
It can be entirely random, just like entropy. Is there like one specific thing that is, like hard magic? We know what it is that does it, or it could be anything,
I think the more varied it is, I think also is the better, because it kind of
gives us a lot more wiggle room for what we do with it.
I think I like it being a little softer, because then the uniqueness of the creatures is also left up to question, and it is presumably from what not only what sparks it, but also the energy that congregates into it at the same time. I think sort of leaving it just kind of up to not necessarily randomness, but just sort of the forces of nature to almost just kind of choose something, probably the better way to do it, just so that it adds a little, I think it leaves a level of mystery behind the creatures, and no one really knows exactly why they sprout up. They kind of understand how, but I think it's better if you leave it a little bit ambiguous.
I have a side question for you.
Okay.
What happens when one of these things dies? Does it then give its energy back, or is it expelled like calories? You know what I mean? Like, is it something that if one of these massive ones were to die or be killed or whatever, does that mean there's now a massive amount of magical energy that is fed back into the world, or is it just sort of a thing that builds up and then
as it disperses, it's deleted? I think it basically feeds it back into the environment, but because one thing we were discussing before, at least on the smaller scale ones, is the idea of people hunting these because they're inherently magical. And so the pieces of them would have inherently magical properties. And so you're taking these things after they've died and are turning them into something else equally magical. But whether humans actually get their hands on it and start to make a sword out of claws or whatever, I don't think really changes the fact that it itself is still magical. And so as it probably decays and feeds itself back to the earth, I think that magical energy would still be connected to it and just sort of redistribute in the area that it died and decayed in.
So for instance, like if one of the big ones dies, does that kind of mean that you can predict that there is going to be suddenly a massive amount of smaller ones / multiple other big ones sprouting up soon in like possibly nearby areas or something like that because of how much just raw magical energy hits the market?
Absolutely. I think that would be the best way to do it. I honestly picture almost all of these things starting small. And then just through a survival of the fittest or luck or whatever means end up just slowly becoming bigger and more powerful. And so like these things, the large ones are intense clusters of magic, and so by sort of dying and redistributing into whatever land they're in, I guess it would also sort of depend on exactly how dense of a magical area they die in the first place. Like if you take one and put it in some place that's, let's say, as dry from magic as it could possibly be, you're probably not going to have as many sprout up because it's just kind of going to, it's like pouring water into a completely dry pot. It's going to disperse, but it's not going to well up. Whereas if you have a whole bunch of moisture, like the pot's been recently rained on, it's already moist. When you pour the water on, it's going to overflow because there's more water sort of in it. But sort of the short answer is, I think as these things die, they would disperse the magical energy. And in the cases of the incredibly large ones, it would probably sprout a whole bunch of smaller ones, and then the cycle would begin anew, basically. So that's the way I would think of it,
Okay. So, dare we start on the map?
I don't know. The
Part of me is tempted to pick up some beans. Or some rice, but
or some
I don't know,
almonds.
do we want to have more hands-on with some almonds?
I think it would be better if when we actually start to make the geography of the map, if we start to do a method similar to that, to have it so it could be shown. Maybe a bit of a top-down perspective sort of thing.
I totally agree.
But what we could start doing right now is like you were saying, coming up with little pieces that we know we want to be there, so that we can insert them when we see fit. So we know we have a mountain range that we need to make.
And this is probably going to be a more central one as well, because we said that we kind of want it to be dividing.
Yes, definitely. We never even really settled with at least the wind dragon, whether it was going to be just like a mountain, or you were thinking something like this.
Yeah, I kind of like the idea of maybe not necessarily strictly up and down, but like a big old plateau. Man, I forget. I feel like there's got to be some kind of example that I could show, but hey, maybe we pop up in the center here a little picture of what I'm envisioning, where it's very, very like steep on the edges, and it's got a big old plate on the top.
Well, I don't know the name of it, but there's one place like that in Australia that's kind of famous.
Yeah, totally. I feel like that's. I'm not going to compare myself. Sorry, Australia.
I'll do my best to find what you're thinking of.
Sounds good, thank you. We'll go over it afterwards.
See if I can green screen. Yeah.
I was mulling it over a little bit more, and I think it would be kind of interesting, if you did have something sort of like that.
Yeah, because I like the way that sort of separates them from everything else around them, and then they have like sort of an isolated culture, because I feel like that's kind of how, not only does that put them so much closer to the sky, but it also kind of lets a culture in isolation kind of stew. And it's like, I'm assuming that there'd be, small like walkways and bridges and stuff that go down the side of this thing, so they're not completely separated or anything like that, but just kind of visually and aesthetically, and what's the word I'm looking for?
I was kind of picturing, like, maybe sort of a
Totally,
pathway
like,
that kind of spirals up,
yeah.
not like perfectly, but it would be really cool if, like, at certain points it got like pretty treacherous, and then there's like water flow coming down and actually kind of splashes over top of and is eroding away the pathway, and so like
visually speaking, I like the idea of maybe not necessarily all of it, but some of it being like planks of wood jutting out from the side of this thing, or like maybe there's a broken portion or something like that, like a bridge. I just like, even more than having it be like a precarious cliff, being like you're walking over nothing. Like, so be that, like planks on a portion of it that make basically like a bridge that's sticking into the side of this thing, or otherwise like suspension bridges and stuff like that. I really like the picture in my head about,
so like they have like maybe a level,
like wooden planks attached by ropes that is holding you over a giant vertical drop.
Yeah, so like maybe they have like little sections that are kind of like wrapping around in certain areas too. One thing I kind of considered is the fact that maybe we could have like sort of multiple of these sorts of plateaus, and then like some of them may, like you said, maybe connect via bridge.
Is this called a mesa? Is that what this is?
That might be what it's called.
I think it's a mesa.
Okay.
If I could see what you were talking about, actually, you want to turn the iPad towards me?
Behold.
That might be correct. I'd have to.
I mean, we got Google. But either way, I think it might be cool if there was sort of like geographically there's a place in China that's kind of got this sort of thing as well.
China's got crazy geography. It's so cool.
Like these sort of large pillars, and we can consider them on a bigger scale, but having them sort of connect to each other and then having like this large central one,
the Grand Mesa.
Yeah,
it is a mesa.
That could be an interesting idea, but we've got to find out how to put that somewhere.
Okay. So what did you envision it as? Because in my mind, I jump right away to either very cold or very warm. I think my initial reaction was very hot, like they're in like a desert. But also the snow-capped peaks, that seems pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. If you want to take enough inspiration from monks and stuff like that, like the snowy peak kind of is there for the taking.
It's immediately evocative.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's something to be said about being in like the middle of a desert and having these things jut into the sky with a little civilization of these enlightened people. I think that's pretty neat too.
In the middle of a desert, or like middle of the ocean, could be
Honestly,
kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's also good.
Or maybe not even in the middle of the ocean, but off the coast a little bit, and then like maybe the only way back. Oh, that could be really cool. Picture like this is kind of the coastline, and you're looking at like maybe a little square like this being a kilometer, so like really not that far out, but it's almost like it starts kind of like here, and they have like these little sort of mesas that kind of build up, and so you can kind of see them from the coast, and they almost sort of like loom over a little bit until you find like the big one, maybe even a little bit further out that way. But I kind of like the idea of like we said, there might be a cool little path that kind of spirals up like that. But when you get to the bottom of the path,
so
there's just a little tiny. Yeah.
These are in the water, right?
Yes, that's
okay.
correct.
Cool. At first, I was totally looking at it the other way, and possibly other people might have the same.
There we go.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of a cool visual to like picture coming from the top, and you're walking down this treacherous stone pathway that's like somewhat maintained, because realistically these people don't come down very often.
They're not
And then-
builders, they're thinkers.
Yeah, and then they get to the bottom, and then there's just this tiny little dock that comes out to a fucking rowboat.
Yeah.
And that's how they make their way. That's how they make their way back to civilization if they actually have to. It's just like it gives them not only vertical isolation, but also just like actual
physical separation.
Like there's 2 layers of
Yeah.
reasons why people don't actually make their way out here.
And you got also, you're kind of at the mercy of the ocean as well, because like let's say that it's just a stormy day, or it's a particularly stormy ocean, even just in general. Good luck getting your little rowboat up to the dock when the dock is like having 15-foot swells or something like that.
Oh, exactly. And then there's also the risk of being smashed up against these gigantic rock pillars. Like, yeah, if the tide is particularly choppy that day, I think that's kind of a cool idea. I like that visually and also conceptually. So it's not out in the middle of the ocean. You could row there. It's just by no means comfortable.
Yeah.
And it's actually risky. And then like also kind of the picture of like a little bit of like just you can see where the tide sort of takes the like goes up and then comes down, and you can see like barnacles and like stuff creeping up the rocks from the bottom as well. Gives them like this sort of imposing feel to them. I think that's really cool. I also
don't know if there's anything that we'll end up doing with this idea I just had, but it also kind of makes me think of how cool it would be to have like a lot of different caves in these things as well, just like visually.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if that's anything that we'll actually need to expand on, but I do like the idea of it being out in
just the occasional like, oh, you're not going around, you're going through, and then popping out the other side is also kind of a cool idea too. I mean, that's just a little detail that if you actually wanted to put, it doesn't have to be there, but if you're just describing the spectacle of this place to a reader or a player, having that could be really cool. Just like little stuff like that really makes it feel like
you don't have to do anything with it, but oftentimes when you are building your world and you're starting with something, if you kind of get an itch in one direction, go with that. Follow your gut, follow your heart, because that's the stuff that you're going to be the most passionate about, and therefore then you're going to make the most beautiful, and people are going to be interested in that because you put so much, into that.
Not only thought, but the passion behind it as well is also the fuel for what makes stuff cool. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I like the idea of it being out in the ocean.
Should there be like a cool name for the? My initial thought's Dragon's Teeth, but like I feel like that's overdone.
Nothing jumps to my brain, and let's find out for sure what those are called.
Yeah.
Before we nail it down.
Yeah.
The audience is gonna find out a lot sooner than you
are. People are gonna be furiously Googling before we even know what the hell's going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm gonna be furiously Googling before this is uploaded.
Yeah. But yeah, so I like the idea of them being out on the ocean there. That's a cool idea, and so that's something we definitely need to put on the coastline.
Okay.
Oopsie.
Ooh, I have a follow-up thought.
Yes.
Do we want this to be out in like offshore out into the ocean? Do we want it to be in a bay? Do we want it to be like what expands beyond? I mean, I guess we don't have to focus on that yet. We can come back to that.
We can, but I mean,
God,
we can touch on it now.
Making maps and geography.
I liked making. I've only made like 1 or 2 maps on mine. I don't dive into the maps nearly as much, but I also just tend to not write stuff down nearly as much. But I think on this, it would be, I think the coolest if it just went, like if it was just ocean back here.
Okay.
Because if it's surrounded by a bay, then it almost gives like a little bit of safety.
Separation.
Exactly, whereas
if it's out in the middle of the ocean, it does not only feel more like separate and isolated, but it is physically separated. Yeah, I like that of it being out by itself, not attached to any land, and therefore also not necessarily under the influence of other nations and stuff like that as well, because we kind of have them separate as not necessarily like a nation or a state. They're just kind of like almost, maybe not specifically, but almost kind of like a religious like
collective.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're definitely big enough. you could call them their own civilization, but they're almost not big enough to actually almost be called that technically.
I pictured them being in the maybe like thousands or lower, not like a lot of people. Like, this is not necessarily in my mind huge.
No.
Big enough to have like a village on it, but not like a massive city that's gonna have like international trade, you know, like pretty low key.
You know, like very, very separate, but they're separated so much that you can't lump them into any other category.
One other interesting thing that like you can kind of start building around this is like, what do they eat? Probably got to be like, because it's a lot of work to go get the fish.
Yeah.
But you don't really have farms out there. You know, you can maybe have some kind of farms, but it's going to be a very different diet that they're going to have than somebody who is in a fertile, lush plains area with just farmland.
Probably a lot of birds.
Interesting point.
All
right.
Like, they might just straight up eat seagulls. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you're right. Like, the level of agriculture that would actually be up there is very, very minimal. Probably some.
Yeah,
but
you can still grow stuff. Like, I don't know what kind of dirt you got, but hey, you can grow potatoes, like...
virtually anywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, that might be an interesting thing, too, is that they might use a certain amount of their agriculture to just straight up attract other, like, oceanic birds as well, and that's their meat. But we might not need to jump into that right now until we've zoomed directly in, because I'm sort of picturing, like I said, there might be like a small amount of them here, small amount of them here, definitely most of them up here, but it might be kind of cool to have like little like semi-villages, like kind of dispersed out on top of other mesas, or hopefully that's what it is. But that could be cool too, and it sort of begs the question here too: is what is here? Like what are they off the coast of? And it kind of makes me think. I think it would be cool if there was a powerful civilization that was right next door to them, but just doesn't bother to touch them. It just kind of creates an interesting contrast. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. But I mean, also, we could even make it 3 levels where this is dense tropical forest or something like that, and they not only are they isolated vertically and via the ocean, but also trying to go on land over there to even get close could also be difficult.
Yeah, I like the idea that nobody really goes there. Like, people come from there, but nobody really goes there, and that can be even more physically the case, like, because you can't. But it can also be like that they're not welcome there. How much physical separation do you want for these guys?
Well, that's kind of my question. Is like, we already have at least 2 layers, and it can be kind of cool. It would be kind of cool as a landmark for a nearby city to see them, and for someone to be like, oh, what are those? And it's like, oh, you can't go there. Those are the wind lizard people. And they kind of stick to their own, and we don't bother them. And so it creates like this level of intrigue immediately. And it's also, even though they're not directly connected to the city, it's kind of a landmark within it, and so it can kind of create some interesting pieces that way. But then again, also, like, again, in making them overly isolated, kind of nails in the point even further. So I don't know. What do you think?
I do like the idea that they are kind of adjacent to people living a very, very different lifestyle. So in my mind, I think maybe not necessarily like another layer of physical separation. We could, I think, have some kind of livable place there, be that a powerful neighbor or what. But I think I like the idea of having them within eye shot or whatever of people living a very, very separate lifestyle.
Okay, so we would have like a some sort of city or something close by, so that they're not completely out of reach, but the ocean and vertical separation that they have kind of proves the point in the first place.
And then they have an emotional separation from the people that are nearby.
Yeah, totally. So that's a cool idea. I like that. So putting them on the coast is, definitely the coolest I think, in that sort of regard.
Okay.
When it comes down to the red dragon, obviously we wanted them to be sort of a sort of central piece, and in between two sort of more powerful nations.
2 or more, even, also.
That's
Because
kind
this
of-
is going to be a large, like, chain of mountains, yeah?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So there can be multiple along that stretch as well. But definitely between,
like
dividing.
It is the border between
Yeah,
them effectively. We could sort of make that here.
You want it to be relatively close?
It could be. It could be this very nation here that whatever is in this sort of area, and then maybe have something over here. Just because it kind of puts these two close together. Not sure if we want them to be close together.
No, that's what I'm thinking about.
But
Yeah, I almost lean actually to keep them further away.
okay.
To keep the density up for the rest of the world, because I mean, obviously, there's going to be more things in other spaces.
Yeah.
But as far as like big set pieces,
Mm-hmm.
to have them slightly more spread out evenly
It's
'cause-
probably a better idea, yeah. I think so too, but it just sort of becomes the question, like when you have a civilization, it's like, oh, is that one also the one that's connecting to the red dragon? But no, you're probably right there. So we have this coastal civilization here. I mean, them being on the ocean also kind of puts them close to the turtle, because the turtle will
It
probably
does.
show up
Yeah,
here.
exactly. Yeah.
Which might actually that could be sort of an interesting plot line too. Just like one of the wise monks comes down is like, hey, you guys are, the turtle showing up. Get ready, and that can create like a little level of hysteria amongst the people there. It could just be a fun way that they kind of interact.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of thonker chonking when you start getting down into the nitty gritty of the map making. That's for sure. One thing that kind of came to my attention as well is we don't really have any sort of forest creatures, and I kind of wanted to make some. I kind of had the idea to start throwing some more medium-sized stuff out there just to see what.
Do you want to
what
have
sticks.
these before we do you want to come up with the forest one before we come up with the forest, or do you want to start building things and then be inspired and put things in those places?
It's kind of a good question. I don't think, you really don't have to do one before the other, but I think actually the geography might beg the question of the actual creature more, because obviously just like where it is can mean what animal is it.
Yeah, and if we come up with some specifics about this forest that give us a vibe, then we can create something, that fits that vibe that we've already created.
So we have a coastal area. Where do we go from here?
Well, I've got a couple of things that I do want to make sure are in the map at the end of all this.
Okay.
Love me a desert.
Oh yeah.
Love a desert. Also, I don't remember if I mentioned this on camera or not. I want like a crescent moon shaped bay with a big ol' island in the middle.
Okay, so sort of like
That was not mentioned on camera.
okay, that's
No, beforehand.
so like an island like this with something like that.
Not an island, like a bay. It can be attached to the main continent or whatever, but with sections of the land that kind of come out and have like this more or less like covered, thank you, or sheltered bay. So let's say, totally just an example, but like, that's not it. Thank you. We got coastline or whatever, and then like let's wrap it around, and then come back down or whatever. Anything like that, and then like I want a thing like that. You know what I mean?
So this is the
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is connected to the main continent
Yeah.
here, and then you have like this sort of little island right here.
And it could even be a tiny island or something like that. I just really love A bay. I love a bay.
Yeah, totally. Obviously, that little center island's going to be
Oh, significant for sure.
the coolest thing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is...
And if it's magical, so be it.
Well, this is kind of an example of what I meant by, like, just sort of cool and unique things. Magic being what magic is and where it congregates is just a little island like that. Immediately your brain says, there's something cool about that place.
Yeah, it does.
And that's sort of how the magic system, I think, sort of works, is the stuff that sort of begs your attention is the stuff that is inherently magical because it does that. It's a tad spoilery for my world, but I'm sure at least you noticed, I know you noticed that when we got there's an island at the coast of where you guys are currently.
I'm the type of sicko that straight up pulls up the map, just goes around the entire thing. That's sick, I'm going right there. That's sick, I'm going there. Yeah.
I only have this place made in idea.
Yeah.
But I thought it would be really cool if there was an island off the coast that had a hole that went like way down into the earth.
Interesting.
And so this sort of it might be a cool idea if this island is sort of like it's obviously like a raised level of land. But then right in the middle of it, right here, or just like throughout it, is just a hole that goes like way down in D&D terms, like into the Underdark or something like that.
Minecraft brain connected to the ocean.
I feel like that's regular brain. Like how many times you made a hole at the beach and you're just like, okay, now we dig it out here.
Fill it with water.
Yeah, exactly. That's just something that kind of popped into my brain as something that could be cool. It's just an island off the coast that just goes down.
My brain also instantly went to like some kind of connection to the moon.
Well, yeah,
like,
because
the
the crescent shape in the first place, yeah.
I see what I'm cooking. Yeah, and like just the visuals that come with that, and maybe like there's some kind of like druidic people, or used to be, or something like that, and there's remnants of it, but it's somehow connected to the moon or the night or the stars or something like that. That's kind of the like, visual that my brain went to.
Interesting. So yeah, you want it to be related to the moon in some sort of way. What?
But I mean, we can work on that later. That's one thing that I like, an element that I want in the map.
Okay.
Desert. I want a little island in the Crescent Bay.
What are we gonna do to the desert that makes it particular to any other sort of place? And also, what sort of desert are you thinking? Are you thinking like specifically just like very sand, very dunes, or possibly are we thinking one like a Wile E. Coyote looking one where you got all these sort of stone pillars? Are you thinking you could even do a snowy desert? Because deserts don't necessarily have to be hot.
You know what? I want it to be sand.
Okay.
And I think that like where the desert starts, I think that's really cool to have that be more of the Wile E. Coyote thing, but then kind of as it like breaks away from other things, like maybe some mountain ranges that bring precipitation, as it kind of extends, it just gets dunier. I don't even know what I'd do with that, but I just want there to be a desert. I like a desert.
Well, what makes me think is we want to put these beasts here. So I'm like, what beast is related to what place? Now, speaking of Dune,
Worm.
Could do some sort of giant worm. I think that would be a little too inspired.
Yeah, that feels a little on the nose.
Although something that you could do, that desert crab. You know what? I love the energy. I was thinking a snake.
Okay.
One, you find snakes in deserts in the first place. And secondly, it does have that sort of slinking beneath the sand, like in the similar way that you would find with like the worms in Dune, or basically any land worm in any piece of media. But yeah, instead of doing that, because again it feels a tad overdone, having a sort of snake that could be even cool too. Have you seen those snakes that are move in the desert? Yeah, they kind of move like that, and they sort of leave these tracks.
Yeah.
What if, picture this, giant snake that as it sort of moves, it creates and carves the dunes within the desert, and it would make it even harder to find your way out of that place
Mhm.
because you can't even recognize the dunes at this point because they'll always shift around
Yeah.
you, and so the shifting sands.
When you said that, I immediately started thinking like the cracks in the ground you would find in a desert.
Are you talking about like old lake, like dried up lake where it like sort of peels up like that?
Yeah. That's what I immediately thought of.
That could be cool. That's something we might be able to put into the desert, is maybe an area where like water will congregate when there is water, and then it dries up equally quickly and then just kind of crackles up up like that, like some sort of oasis could be cool. But I do kind of like the idea of a snake of some kind that could that kind of carves its way through the dunes. And snakes there's so many different kinds of them too. Like, how cool would it be that there's a giant rattler and it's like, maybe its rattles are just like so big that it ends up sounding like crazy, just like
Sounds like thunder or something.
Yeah, the thunder snake, the thunder rattler.
I picture this one being a more medium one.
Okay. Yeah, not incredibly gigantic, but obviously big enough to like shift the sand around it. But yeah, it wouldn't be as big as any of the main three for sure. It's got to be a smaller one.
So I also picture, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the entire world or anything like that, but when it comes to fantasy things, I love the idea of like sharp features.
Okay.
Like some mountain ranges that like are just steep mountain, steep valley, and like just the visualization of kind of going through that valley. It gives me serotonin.
Gives you the
so
good.
I definitely want to have, and then we can make this anywhere, right? Because when you zoom into any mountain, you can make it like that. But I want to have some sharp features in that sense. Do you have any like specific geologic like features or shapes that you want present in this map?
I wasn't thinking necessarily of shapes in the same sort of way, like in a top-down sort of sense, like with the with your sort of bay here. Mostly just sort of thinking of interesting things to put into it. Nothing immediately comes to mind off the top of my head, though. Taking inspiration from something that you've already seen in my world is something that could be very interesting, is sort of a cliff. In mine, it's got a nice little tree right here. But I think that's also a very interesting geography thing, is a cliff that is so big it sort of separates what's on the top from what's on the bottom.
For sure, yeah.
We could do something...
I mean, it seems sick to have an entire city underneath a cliff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're telling me. But though that's one thing I just am so partial to. Like, I've already made it once, and I just like the idea of it in general. Another thing, taking inspiration from something I've sort of already thought of, is sort of circular range of mountains that has a valley on the inside here and has a little civilization on the inside. Maybe not even little. In mine, it's very big. But having a place that's sort of just surrounded and has its own sort of almost defensive structure automatically there.
Are they isolationist at all, or are they still pretty...
In mine, they are the primary force in the Empire. For me, that's King's Quarter. They're, in my world context for the audience, at least the main Empire, main sort of continent area that my players are playing in, there was 4 empires that eventually kind of got united under a single banner. They kept their independence from each other and sort of stayed their own provinces within the kingdom. And so they've split up into different quarters. The smallest but most powerful of them is called King's Quarter, which is the main capital and the main empire. And I just like the contrast because I made it the smallest area out of any of the 4 quarters, but it is also the most powerful economically and militarily, and so it has become, despite its size, the leader of all 4 of them.
The seat of power,
And yeah, they sit in a very, very calm valley that sits under a mountain range that surrounds them.
Mm-hmm.
I find that to be sort of geologically interesting.
For sure.
So we might want to I kind of like the idea of having something like that, but it's also not 100% necessary.
So, okay, I got 2 diverging thoughts here.
Okay.
Part of me says it's fantasy. Don't worry about why there's a circular range of mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of me says it's a big fucking volcano. To another volcano. That's why there's like the caldera or whatever of the volcano.
Just the biggest empire in the goddamn world, and then one day it just gets Yosemite or where am I thinking? Or Yellowstone.
Yeah,
it just gets.
Yeah.
That would be so funny. Players don't even get to do anything. It's just like, oh, we're gonna go fight the Empire. No, you're not. It's just disintegrated. Sorry.
Oh yeah, that got erupted.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have anything like this that I specifically want to.
I mean,
to put
like,
into
we can
the map.
always create things like later as we go. It's just with certain things, especially like with
Little
the
coastlines
little
like that.
coastline thing, that you need to have in your brain pretty quick so that you can, like, when you make the shape of the continent,
Mm-hmm.
or if you drop your rice,
Mm-hmm.
maybe we do that in a future episode. That sounds fun.
Mm-hmm.
You can put those on there because they affect the silhouette of your map.
Yeah.
The rest of it, as you fill in later, you can continue to change as you go.
Mm-hmm.
But for the silhouette, might as well get those things in your mind.
Yeah, totally. Well, like for example, a bay with the specific coastline. Oh, that could be an interesting idea. It's a little similar to the bay that you sort of have here, but just in terms of gigantic monsters and coastlines. What if, sort of similar to this, there was a coastline that was just like this, and then it had just this sort of something like that out of it, and the lore is that a gigantic beast took a fucking bite out of the land, and now there's just this gigantic watery canyon there. That could be even cool too. Like, speaking of cliffs, what if it's like one of those coastlines that is a gigantic sort of cliffside overlooking the ocean, and then there's just this big section of it that's just completely missing. And it would be funny if just someone pissed off the turtle, and there could even be like a little bit of a civilization around, but it used to be a much bigger civilization, and the central piece of it just got eaten.
Or even if that's just what they say, and that's the local lore. Like, I want to say it's Ireland, like the Giant's Causeway and stuff like that.
Okay.
You don't know. That was... It's a geological feature, but, like, in the history, they got all this, like, stuff like, oh, this was created because of this, and, that kind of thing. So even if
that's not technically
knows
true.
that that's true, that can be such a thing that's like, oh, before the people that lived here knew how to write, they used to be this bigger city, and then they angered the gods or whatever, and then they were smitten down by
the snapping turtle of Biggin. I just kind of, again, in regards to stuff that's like, again, it's just we have big beasts, so why not use them to actually shape the geography around? So that's definitely one that could sort of be formed. But yeah, I don't have any other specific geological like silhouetted features that I want to overlay on this. So yeah, so I think that's probably a good area of just kind of spitballing ideas on what to start throwing into your world.
Yes.
And obviously, as we start to throw these things together, it'll beg more questions and therefore create more answers. But we're gonna start, I think, next episode by actually attempting the good old tried and true beans/rice method, just so you can see it in action, and we'll start attaching these things to it and see what starts to sprout from there. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.